When thinking about how markets operate, an essential ingredient that we have to come to grips with first is the demand for a good or service that's being offered for sale in the market. Now, when we start thinking about, well, what factors will influence the demand for a good, we can obviously come up with a whole list of factors, such as the number of buyers in the marketplace, the income of the buyers, the prices of related goods that could also affect the demand for a product, price expectations, and tastes for the product, which in turn could be influenced by advertising, culture, personal preferences, and so on. The main factor that we're going to look at here, though, is the price of the product, which is a pretty obvious one to start with. So how do we define demand for a product in terms of price? Here's an abstract statement or definition of the demand for a good or service. It is the maximum quantities of some good or service that buyers are willing and able to purchase at various corresponding prices at some time period, usually within some kind of geographical area. Note here we're just talking about a relationship between prices and the maximum quantities that buyers would be willing and able to purchase. So we're holding constant all of the other factors which could conceivably influence the quantity demanded. So we're going to introduce, as part of our definition of demand, a ceteris paribus clause, that is, a holding all other things equal clause. So we're imagining that all the non-price factors which could affect the demand, the quantity demanded for a product, are frozen or held constant or are not changing. So that includes things like the income of the buyers, the tastes of the buyers, and so on. A meteor doesn't come and strike the earth and destroy everyone. We're assuming none of those things are occurring. Okay. So if we think of an example, we would say that, we're talking about kebabs in Auburn on a daily basis. So we'd say demand for kebabs in Auburn on a daily basis is the maximum number of kebabs that buyers are willing and able to purchase at various prices in a day in Auburn. That would be the demand for kebabs in Auburn daily. We can we can represent this definition with a table, an illustrative table. So here's a schedule of various prices per kebab and the quantity of kebabs that's demanded by Auburn consumers daily. We can see there at the price of $7, 4,000 kebabs would be demanded daily. At the price of $4, 7,000 kebabs would be demanded daily. These represent what we'd call quantities demanded. They do not represent what we call demand per se. Demand per se refers to all of the possible quantities demanded at various corresponding prices. So it means the whole table or the entire schedule. That is demand for kebabs. So you should make that distinction clear in your mind between the quantity demanded at a particular price and demand per se, which is various quantities demanded at various prices. And we can represent that table in the form of a graph. If we plotted these points, we can see we've got at the price of $10, the quantity demanded is 1,000. At the price of $2, the quantity demanded is 9,000. And we've got all the points in between. So we can call this a demand curve. It's representing demand. Any particular point on that demand curve reflects the quantity demanded at a particular price. The entire curve, however, represents demand for kebabs per se. Now you'll note there that we've got a certain kind of relationship happening. There's an inverse or a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. That is to say, the two variables move in opposite directions. When the price of kebabs falls, the quantity demanded daily increases. And when the price rises, the quantity demanded decreases daily. We can call this the law of demand. Why do we call it a law? Well, first, because there's clearly a relationship between these two variables. That seems to be a kind of regular relationship. And also because for very many products, this is the case. So if you took the example of petrol instead of kebabs, it would probably be true that if the price of petrol fell, the quantity demanded would rise. If we took the case of cars, if the price of cars rises, then the quantity demanded is likely to fall. Tomatoes, same story, and so on and so forth, for the vast majority of products. So we say that we've got this law of demand, and the demand curve shows us all of these various corresponding prices. When the prices change, we move along this demand curve. Now, an inquiring mind is going to ask, well, why is there this law of demand? Why should it be that when the price of a good falls, the quantity demanded will rise, and vice versa? Well, from the perspective of standard economic theory, we have two things going on. So it's as if the consumer is thinking of two issues simultaneously. So we'll stick with our kebabs example. When the price of kebabs falls, consumers realize that kebabs now are relatively cheaper than an alternative which they could have purchased, such as slices of pizza. And because the kebabs are relatively cheaper now, consumers will switch away from slices of pizza to the relatively cheaper kebabs, and thus the quantity demanded of kebabs increases. We call this the substitution effect for the obvious reason that the consumer is substituting one good for another, one alternative for another. So this helps explain why it is when the price of kebabs falls, the quantity demanded rises. But there's something else the consumers or the buyer is also thinking of. And it's this. As the price of kebabs falls, the consumer can afford to buy more than they could before with their money, with their nominal income or their nominal budget. Nominal income or nominal budget just means the cash they've got in their pocket and the money they've got in the bank. Now, when the price of kebabs falls, they can afford, with the same amount of money, to buy more than they could before. Now, if we assume that kebabs are a normal good, where a normal good is something you would like to have more of if you can afford it, then, since consumers can afford to buy more, they will increase the quantity demanded of kebabs. This is called an income effect. So we have these two effects, both contributing to our law of demand. The price of kebabs falls. The substitution effect results in an increase in the quantity demanded, and the income effect results in an increase in the quantity demanded. Remember, for the income effect, however, we assumed something. We assumed that kebabs were a normal good. So a little complication to that story is that if kebabs were not a normal good, but rather were an inferior good, kind of a crappy product, then the income effect will actually work in the opposite direction. That is, as the price of kebabs falls, the purchasing power of people's money rises, and so they will switch away from the inferior good. They can afford to buy more of a better quality product, and they will buy less of the inferior good, the kebabs. So in that case, if kebabs are an inferior good, when the price falls, ironically, maybe ironically is the wrong word, anyway, then there'll be a decrease in the quantity demanded. So the substitution effect still holds, but in this case, the income effect is moving in the opposite direction. Generally speaking, however, we would say that the income effect is overpowered or outweighed by the substitution effect, so that nonetheless, overall, the law of demand would still hold. The price of kebabs falls and the quantity demanded rises. Although it doesn't rise as much as it would have if kebabs were a normal good. A couple of other questions one could ask about this demand curve. The first is, does the demand curve have to be a straight line as we've drawn it? And the answer is no. You could have a demand curve which is curved like this, for example. Nonetheless, you can still see that the law of demand still holds. That is, as the price of the good falls, the quantity demanded rises, and vice versa. But another question, slightly more tricky and puzzling perhaps, is, does the law of demand have to apply in all cases, no matter what kind of product we're talking about? And the answer to that is no. The law of demand doesn't always have to apply. We can think of scenarios where it wouldn't. For example, if we were talking about a unique necessity, a unique absolute necessity, say if we were thinking about the demand for insulin on the part of diabetics. Now, diabetics are going to need a biologically necessary quantity of insulin, assuming the number of diabetics doesn't change, for example. There's going to be a set given demand, quantity demanded of insulin, no matter what the price is. If the price is $2, the consumers might still want 5 units. If the price is $4, they still only want 5 units, 6, and so on. Because the quantity that they demand is biologically determined, and we assume that they don't want to die, so they will buy it no matter what the price is. In that case, we would have a vertical demand curve. The law of demand doesn't apply in this case. When the price falls, the quantity demanded stays the same. When the price rises, the quantity demanded stays the same. In this case, the law of demand is violated. Another example might be if there's a perfect substitute available. So if we said that the price of kebabs were $6 and consumers would be willing to buy any quantity of kebabs or whatever it is, any quantity of a product at $6. But if the price were to rise above $6, consumers would switch completely to the alternative, the perfect substitute alternative, which does exactly the same thing as the product in question. So in that case, we would have a demand curve which is horizontal. you can sell any quantity will be demanded at $6, but at $8 nothing will be demanded. Consumers will switch to the perfect substitute. Lucky last, we could have something called a giffen good. And a giffen good would be a good which is an inferior product. Now, if you remember earlier, I talked about an inferior product, and that was a good which, when the price fell, consumers feel wealthier or richer, so they can afford to buy more normal products. And they will decrease their quantity demanded of inferior products. This is this perverse income effect for inferior goods. In the case of a giffen good, we say that the income effect is so powerful that it outweighs the substitution effect. So that overall, when the price of a good falls, the quantity demanded would not increase, but decrease. And, perversely, vice versa. If the price of the giffen good increases, the quantity demanded, weirdly, would also increase. So we could have a demand curve which looks like this. And this is the upward sloping portion of a demand curve. And this we would classify it as a giffen good. Presumably, however, as the price of the good rose higher and higher, the substitution effect would eventually become dominant, would overpower the income effect, so that we would get a downward sloping demand curve again. So it's conceivable that you could have a weird looking demand curve like this. However, in all of these cases, we would say these are usually exceptions to the rule. The fact that they're exceptions kind of proves the generality of the law of demand for most products. Okay, so we've been focusing on changes in the price of a good affecting the quantity demanded. So we have a demand curve, and usually that demand curve will adhere to the law of demand. But what about all of those non-price factors that we talked about or mentioned earlier, such as what if there were changes in the number of buyers in the market? What if the incomes, the nominal income, the cash people have in their pockets, what if that changes? What if their expectations about the price of the product were to change? What if their tastes change? What if the prices of related products change? All of these factors can also affect the quantity demanded. And they're independent of, we generally assume, they're independent of the price of the product that we're looking at, so the price of kebabs. So how do we represent this idea, these additional factors? Well, if we increase the number of buyers in the marketplace, then presumably, no matter what the price was, no matter what the price of kebabs was, there would be greater quantity demanded of kebabs. If, assuming that the income of the kebab buyers went up, then, and assuming it's a normal good, then presumably the buyers would want to buy more kebabs than before, even if the prices hadn't changed, the price of kebabs hadn't changed. If the price of substitute goods went up, if the price of, say, slices of pizza went up to $1,000 a slice, then presumably people would switch over to kebabs, and there would be an increase in the quantity demanded of kebabs, even if the price hadn't changed. If the price of complementary goods, goods that go with the kebab, that make the kebab more enjoyable, if the prices of those goods went down, say, for example, the price of hummus or the price of tabbouleh crashed, then presumably people would be willing to buy more kebabs than before, even if the price of kebabs themselves hadn't changed. And if price expectations changed, for example, if the consumers believed that kebabs were going to increase in price to $1,000 a kebab tomorrow, they might increase their demand for kebabs now, even if the price hadn't changed. And if consumers suddenly liked the product more than they did before, so their taste changed in a positive direction, then whatever the price is, consumers would presumably buy more of the kebabs. So how do we represent that graphically? Well, we'd say that if the price were $4, then they'd buy more than they were willing and able to purchase before. If the price was $6, they'd be willing and able to purchase more than they did before. If the price were $8, they'd be willing and able to purchase more than they did before. So how do we represent this idea graphically? We would be shifting the demand curve to the right, reflecting the fact that the consumers are willing and able to purchase more than before at the corresponding prices. And the same story is going to apply in the other direction. When we're thinking about a decrease in the number of buyers, or a decrease in consumers' income, assuming it's a normal good, or a decrease in the price of substitutes, or an increase in the price of complementary goods, or if you expect prices to fall in the near future, or if consumers just don't like the product as much as they did before. In each of these cases, we would say that no matter what the price is, consumers are willing and able to purchase less than they did before. And we can represent that graphically by shifting the demand curve to the left. So, in summary, what have we learned? We've learnt the law of demand, which says there's an inverse or a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. When price rises, quantity demanded falls. When price falls, quantity demanded rises. We represent the change in price on a curve by shifting along a demand curve, by moving along a demand curve. But when we change all of the other factors which can affect the quantity demanded, we would have to shift the entire curve, either to the right or to the left. If we shift the demand curve to the right, that's indicating an increase in demand, no matter what the price is. And if we shift the demand curve to the left, we're indicating a decrease in demand, no matter what the price level is.